As we continue now in chapter 12, we continue to be in the period that continues from the end of Revelation chapter 11. The difference here is that rather than looking at very specific events, in other words, if we were looking through a camera in chapter 11 and in previous chapters, the camera would be zoomed in on specific events. Events taking place in Jerusalem. Events taking place in the throne room of God. Events taking place in specific locations or with specific persons. Here now the camera has zoomed back. So we have a broad view over space and time. So when we look into chapter 12, we're going to see what we call a double entendre, which we see this a lot in Scripture, where there are references both to historical significance, that is, to things in history which have already occurred, as well as prophetic significance, so that the two items can be linked together to show their total significance, both historically and prophetically. When the two things are linked together, it demonstrates their spiritual significance as well, showing the sovereign hand of God in all things. Also in this chapter, we're going to get as close as we can possibly get to one question that we addressed in a previous commentary, and that question was, how is the world repopulated following the Great Tribulation period if all life on earth is destroyed? Obviously, God has the power to recreate mankind as He created Adam and Eve in the beginning, but multiple references throughout Scripture seem to give us a fairly clear indication that this is not the case, that in fact, when the earth is populated at the time of the millennial kingdom, that these are people who already know God. And we have a pretty strong indication of where they come from and the reason why they come from this particular location in this chapter is in fulfillment of a promise that the Lord repeated over and over concerning the salvation and deliverance of a remnant of Israel throughout the Old Testament prophets. So let's begin taking a look at chapter 12, and keep in mind as we look at chapter 12 that this is still a continuation of the events we looked at in chapter 11, so that when we see time frames mentioned, chapter 11 primarily took place during the first half of the tribulation, when there was a time of relative peace. And as we mentioned before, that time of relative peace did not mean that it was a comfortable time of living. But what it did mean was that there were not wars, and there was not these tremendous famines and pestilences and these terrible things taking place that are about to take place. A lot of the calamities that we see mentioned throughout the book of Revelation don't reach their full force and their full intensity until the second half, when Satan is loosed to do his worst. And the book of Daniel even tells us that there comes a time when Satan becomes jealous, when Antichrist himself becomes jealous because he doesn't want the God of heaven to be worshipped. He himself wants to be worshipped. And that's the time when Satan's full influence comes to bear here on earth. So we're going to see that transition take place here in chapter 12, and that's when the full intensity of these calamities begin to be realized. So starting in chapter 12, we see John speaking of this great wonder in heaven. He speaks of this woman that's clothed with the sun and a moon under her feet and a crown on her head with 12 stars. And remember, we talked about that number 12. And that number 12 is that godly number of government, godly number of leadership. In fact, this is symbolically Israel. Whenever we see a woman mentioned with respect to the earth, and we see that woman being a woman of God, and we see her being mentioned symbolically, this woman is going to be the nation of Israel. From this woman, we see in verse 2 that she travailed and she delivered, and this is, of course, delivering both the nation of Israel and specifically delivering the promised Messiah. There's the double reference. And then another wonder in heaven is mentioned. Now, when we say a wonder, the wonder is simply a sign. This sign is a red dragon. This red dragon has 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns. And as we mentioned before, when we see horns and when we see crowns, crowns represent kings and horns represent nations or kingdoms. We've seen that in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel, and we've also seen that referred to here in the book of Revelation as well. So this will be a person who will be a leader among nations. In fact, he will be the Antichrist himself. Actually, he will be, the person they're referring to here is actually Satan himself, being called the Red Dragon, and he will be the influence over Antichrist, who is his man on earth. His tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven. Stars are messengers. Stars are angelos. Stars are angels. When Satan disobeyed God, and we've looked at this before out of Isaiah 14 and out of Ezekiel 28, we saw that he rebelled against the Most High God. And for rebelling against the Most High God, he was cast out of heaven as his place of abode. But as we will learn a little later in this chapter, and as we discussed from Job chapter 1, he is still able to come at this time before God the Father, and he is still able to accuse us. And he's been able to do so since the beginning of creation. Since having been cast out, heaven is no longer his abode, but he can still come before the Father and accuse us. Well, at this time, he will no longer even be able to do that. 3.5 years into the tribulation, he will be kicked out completely. He won't even be allowed to come before the Father and accuse us anymore. Now remember, Satan's a genius, but Satan's an insane genius. And knowing now, as we'll see a little later in this chapter as well, knowing now that he has no options left, there is nothing holding him back from wreaking total havoc upon the earth. And so God uses this evil, spiritual, angelic, demonic genius to do his dirty work for him in judging the earth against those who reject him as their God. The Lord knows what he's doing. And of course we see at the end of verse 4 that Satan's goal is to destroy everybody who loves God, everyone who follows God. He figures, I can't destroy God himself, so I'll destroy everyone who follows God. That's his focus now. At this very day, at the time this recording's being made, but that will even be more so his focus once he no longer is able to come before the presence of God and try in vain to deceive God into punishing us.